we can learn today. As you know, I'm Audra, and so I just wanted to present my project today, my MBA thesis. I'm almost graduated. I'll be graduating next week, so with James. Are you going to be there? Awesome. Yeah. So to begin with, I just wanted to kind of outline a little bit of what I'll be talking about today, and then I'll go through it in more detail. I'll be discussing the purpose of the study, the confidentiality issues, the theoretical framework, the research methodology that I used as I went throughout, the findings and theoretical applications. And then I also have some recommendations for future research, as well as a couple that I presented for the host organization and the lessons I learned, which as an almost MBA graduate, that for me was the whole gist of what I was doing. Like, it was more about learning than it was about finding, although the finding is fun too. But it was just a learning process for me, so that was probably my favorite part. And the purpose and benefit was ultimately to gain a better understanding of organizational culture, the values and beliefs that are below the surface, to answer the research question. Also to see the admissions recruiters empowered to exercise and demonstrate the stated mission and purpose the leaders have for the students, and to see organized intercession integrated as part of the Christian University's culture and structure, and see transformation take place throughout campus. So as you look through these, there's obviously, like, I have some bias. Like, this is an area that's very passionate for me, that I'm very passionate about. And so I realized that going into it, and I had to work closely with other people to make sure that I kind of removed myself as much as possible from this. And also just to kind of look at things from a different perspective. So I made every effort that I could to kind of take myself away from that and have as few biases as possible. The confidentiality is obviously super important, and in any research we do. And so my host organization is a Christian university, but I wanted to protect them. I didn't want any harm or repercussion to come to them, and just to protect the campus as well. So anything I wrote or presented or shared or discussed, I have renamed them as the Christian University, which you will see and hear as I go throughout. I also wanted to protect the research participants, as they trusted me and gave me some very valuable information and were vulnerable with me. So I just wanted to make sure I made every effort to protect them. And so there are some direct quotes, there are some pieces that I've used for my interviews, but I have just randomly made up names to go with them. So there's no rhyme or reason behind it, I just picked a name. And then finally, I made every effort to protect and honor the leaders of the Christian University. In my research, my goal was not to point fingers or dig up dirt or pass blame at all. Like, the whole foundation of this entire project is about honor and trust. And so I made every effort to make sure that whatever we were doing, that we were protecting and honoring the leaders as well. So the Christian University does have a mission that is quite well known, but over the last couple of years, the newer president has stated kind of an extra mission that's kind of his desire of his heart, and I totally resonate with that and love it. So I wanted to share that today just because it did shape a lot of my research. His desire is to produce students who are equipped to be outstanding in their profession and serve as ambassadors of Christ in bringing change, hope, reconciliation, and answers to the world around them. And to me, like I said, I love this. Like, that's something I'm totally passionate about, and I want my life to be about as well. So I wanted to look at this a little bit more in depth. The research question for my project: is there a gap between the underlying beliefs of the admissions department employees of the Christian University and the mission statement and purposes proposed by the university leaders, which is a big statement there. So basically, it's just saying, like, they have this mission for the students, and are the experiences and beliefs of the admissions department, are they in line with each other, or is there a gap between them? So the main theory that I used throughout my project is that of organizational culture, depicted by Edgar Schein, and specifically the iceberg model. I don't know, are any of you familiar with this theory? Or you've probably learned about it or used it. Basically, when you see an iceberg, you see the very tip of the iceberg, and that's what you think of when you're like, oh, an iceberg, and you see this beautiful piece of snow or ice that's on top of the water. But in reality, there's a whole huge piece of the iceberg that's below the surface. And Edgar Schein talks about how those below the surface, you have the beliefs and the values and attitudes, the basic assumptions that all go to help reinforce what's going on above the surface. A lot of times when we look at an organization, you see what's above the surface. You see the buildings, the structure, their product, their branding, a logo, maybe the number of employees or how their financial stuff, their mission. All of those things are above the surface. But what's going on below the surface is helping shape that. And so my goal was to uncover what's going on below the surface. In order to do that, I couldn't just ask direct questions and get simple answers. I kind of had to ask questions all around the issue in hopes to draw some of that stuff out to see what's really going on. So that was my goal. I chose to do a qualitative research design. My unit of analysis was the admissions department. And I used a lot of my own personal observation and experience from work. I have worked for the Christian University for a little over 4 years. And have spent equal time at campus admissions and the sites. And so I used both campus admissions and the sites in my unit of analysis. Hi. And I understand with that, like I've already mentioned before, I understand that I do have some bias. My personal experience and a personal observation does not encompass everything. I've not been around everywhere to all of the sites or to the campus all the time to see everything that's going on. There's also been a lot of change since I've started, and so there are people that have come and gone, and I realize that my experience is maybe doesn't show everything. It does create a good foundation, but it doesn't share everything. So I conducted 9 in-depth interviews with the admissions representatives. 5 of those interviews were with site-based recruiters, and I made sure every region was covered minus the central region, as he had just been hired at that time. And then I did 4 interviews with the campus recruiters. And all of the recruiters I chose were recruiters that had been at at the Christian University the longest. I know. Sorry, surprise. At the Christian University the longest amount of time. And because I wanted to know what was going on and the perceptions and the experiences that they had. So I had to choose people who had been around. And then I took that information, I analyzed the results, and used triangulation to apply theories and, again, try to make sure that I was removing bias from the equation. And yeah. So now we're going to go on to the findings. There were 4 main themes that came from the in-depth interviews: the need for appreciation, need for communication, need for teamwork, and need for innovation and empowerment. And then I'll go through these a little bit more in depth here. The first one is the need for appreciation. And for me, this was the most fascinating one. I found, how many of you are familiar with the 5 love languages? Okay. For those of you, well, good. For those of you who aren't, typically it's a book and a thought that's usually used for marriage or like romantic relationships. But Gary Chapman, who wrote that book, paired up with Paul White, who's from the business world, and they created the 5 languages of appreciation in the workplace. The languages are the same. It's words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service, tangible gifts, and physical touch, which obviously looks a little different in the workplace. But there is a small window where it could be appropriate. So they do have that included. But overall, like, their basic premise of their concept is that people give and receive love or appreciation in different ways. It's like their own language. And so even if you are speaking appreciation to someone, they may not receive it because it's not speaking their language, if that makes sense. You need to know the other person's language in order to have a complete circuit there. So with that in mind, as I interviewed these people, I have to back up just one second here. Prior to doing my interviews, I had kind of forgotten about the love languages. I hadn't really thought about them for a couple years, and I'd been in a conversation a couple days prior to my interviews with a friend of mine, and we were discussing them. So I go into the interviews, and by the third one, I was like, oh, like they are totally, everything they're sharing right now is through their perception. It's almost like a filter, like their perception of their love languages or their languages of appreciation. And I started picking up on that, and I started asking questions, and I went back to the first two people and confirmed. And sure enough, they all had these different languages of appreciation. So 2 out of the 9 people I interviewed actually felt valued. And those 2 people happened to be words of affirmation people, and the leaders, interestingly enough, are words of affirmation people. So they were getting their needs met. I know that it wasn't for a lack of showing appreciation for the others, but it wasn't speaking the right language, so they weren't feeling appreciated, which produced a high level of fear and anxiety. That was probably the main theme that came out of everything, is that there's a lot of fear and anxiety going on. In fact, one person specifically said that he was motivated daily by a fear of disappointment and failure. So that was a good picture of what people were feeling. The second finding was the need for communication, and this was for kind of all-encompassing. That was between the departments, the programs of study, the leadership, especially the regional leaders as they were communicating to their admissions representatives, and within the admissions department itself. All of this led me to the silo effect, which is a very common theory. I had heard about it all throughout my time at the admissions department. I heard about it in context typically to the sites and the admissions reps at the sites, that they were used to working on their own. Basically, the silo effect says that the lack of interaction and information flowing between the departments. And so they're working on their own rather than all together. And I found throughout this research that it wasn't necessarily limited to the sites or limited to the admissions representatives there. It seemed to be a little bit more all-encompassing throughout their interactions with other departments as well. So the third finding was the need for teamwork, which goes hand in hand with the silo effect. I think that they could very well go together. They're just 2 sides of the same coin. Before I go into this a little bit, I just feel like it's important to say that as I interviewed the admissions representatives, they were all very proud of their role. They all knew exactly what they were there to do, and they were very proud of their role within the Christian University. They also appreciated the connection. There had been a couple times when the campus admissions representatives met with the site-based representatives in the same area, and that was appreciated. But overall, there seemed to they just felt like there was a lack of connection and understanding with other departments, which leads me to Lencioni's theory, the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And as you can see, this also looks a little bit like a pyramid or the iceberg that we talked about earlier. And how many of you have read Lencioni's book? Cool, okay, we have a few in here. I highly recommend it if you haven't. But there are, different levels to the levels of teamwork. The very foundational one is the absence of trust. And so without trust, it's hard to deal with conflict because you're scared of what the other person is going to say, or you can't deal with that in a healthy way. There's also issues with commitment or accountability, inattention to results, and all of those, as you go further up, they're all affected by that foundational trust. And trust is directly connected to vulnerability. So the degree to which a leader or a team member or an employee, the degree to which they are willing to be vulnerable is the degree to which they will have trust. And you have to have that foundation. The fourth finding was the need for innovation and empowerment. Almost every single person mentioned, the market and industry are changing. Basically, higher education is changing. There is room for the Christian University to be more innovative and creative, but on the flip side of that, there's also room for the employees to take some more responsibility in that process. One representative in particular said there's a lack of initiative from other employees to learn or get better. They just rely on others to do it. Instead, they need to be empowered to do it. So there's kind of both sides going on. Finally, the conclusion. I found that there does indeed appear to be a gap between the desired outcome for students and the reality experienced with employees, specifically the admissions at the Christian University. And this foundational issue within the organizational culture is due to trust. As we mentioned, trust is the foundation for everything else, like the appreciation, the communication, the teamwork, innovation, empowerment. Those things can't happen if you don't have trust. And without trust, there's a great deal of fear and anxiety, self-protection, and independence, which all lead to the silo effect that we also talked about. So all of those things work together. The recommendations I had for future research was, first of all, to explore the messages administration is specifically sending to staff versus the students. And if you go back to my conclusion here, you see that there is a gap between the outcome for students and the reality experienced by the employees. And so when I spoke with my research professor, she called me out on that and said, Audra, that's not okay. And so when we discussed this, we realized that that is actually a valid point to look into and to research. Is there a difference in the messaging to those two populations within the school? Are they getting the same message? Are they getting different messages? What are the desired outcomes? The second one is to explore the lack of discussion about faith integration in the workplace. As I interviewed students, there were a couple direct questions I had where they answered, but of their own, only a couple of the admissions representatives actually spoke about faith on their own. And so I just want to know, like, why didn't it happen more? Like, why did it not come out more? Is it a personal or cultural preference? Is it connected to more deeply rooted values and beliefs that comprise the organizational culture? Like, what's going on at that level? And then also, do the employees know how to integrate their faith into the workplace? If there is an issue, which we would determine from the earlier question, if there was an issue, is the lack of faith integration, is it a technical issue, a belief issue, an empowerment issue? Like, at what point is that breakdown occurring? And then also to explore, just in the same way as the 5 languages of appreciation, there are also differences in personality. So we can explore personality differences within the departments and how they affect teamwork. And then finally, conduct a similar study in other departments throughout the Christian University to see, like, what's going on? How are the other departments feeling? Are they feeling similarly, or maybe they have a different experience? So just to see what's going on. The recommendations I had for the host organization were to read and discuss in groups the Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and Chapman and White's 5 Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace. And these are very fun, they're very interesting reads, they're easy reads. It would be very doable for employees or leaders to read them and kind of talk in a group, what does this mean for us and how can we integrate this into our workplace? Further reading recommendations would be Danny Silk's Culture of Honor, Louis Upkin's Treat Me Like a Customer, Using Lessons from Life to Succeed in Life, Using Lessons from Work to Succeed in Life, and then Dr. Emerson Eggerich's Love and Respect. You may realize that the last 2 books are actually marriage books, and so, which may sound a little bit odd, but as I read through them, I found that they provided a really great framework to understand how to develop trust with vulnerable and intimate relationships. And so even though that vulnerability and intimacy obviously looks different at work, there is a place for how do you create that and how do you be vulnerable and have trust. So the lessons I learned, which is my favorite part, how to conduct scholarly academic research and why it's important. Honestly, going into my MBA, this is probably the thing I dreaded the most. I just did not think that I would have the patience to really think through research and go through all of the pieces of it. But I realized throughout the process that it's really not as hard as I thought, and the why we do it, why we need to do it, how we need to support our opinions are, we can't just assume things or make decisions. We have to have research to help support that. I also realized that change is difficult. I think that's something we all know. But I realized throughout this research why it's difficult. Like that often we try to change things here at the top, but we don't realize what's going on below the surface. And so when you want change to happen, it really has to go deep below the surface in order to affect what's being visible at the top. The vast depth of organizational culture. For me, like, I felt like I touched on just one little piece of this huge ocean. It's like seeing a little piece of a beautiful coral piece but you have obviously like a whole world full of ocean. So like there's so much more going on. And it was fascinating to me. Honestly, prior to doing my MBA, I had considered other master's programs. I was looking at marriage and family therapy or some counseling stuff, more people oriented. And so it was fascinating to do this and realize that, oh, like business is about people, really. Like there's other things that are going on in the picture, but it's really about people. And so I can use those same skills in business. And yeah, I'm not giving therapy, but I'm still like understanding what's going on and motivating people at a different level. So, and finally, I learned a lot about trust. And I have to say that God did in me everything that I wrote about in my paper. So, and I don't say that lightly. I don't give any recommendations to the Christian university that I haven't had to walk through myself. And it was a very painful process. There were months that it was quite painful. But I realized that I also had those same trust issues in my life. And I wanted to see God move and do things in a certain level, and why wasn't I? And it usually had to come down to trust. And so I realized that even at work, like I tend to have boundary issues. I tend to take on a lot more than what I should. And I found that it really has to do with the fear of people not coming through for me. So if I take it on, I know that I can do it. But in this process, I learned what it means to empower people. And I had to walk through that. I had to take some of my stuff to my boss and say, here you go, I need to trust that you can do this. Or take some stuff to my coworker and say, you know what, this is your responsibility. I mean, I said it in a different way, but just saying like, I empower you to do this. And in order for them to be empowered, I really had to let go. We talked about that prior to this. They can't pick it up if I don't let it go. And so I had to give it to them and let go and walk away. So God really did a transformational work in me throughout this project. And it's something that I'll take with me throughout life. So thank you. Do you have any questions?
Oh, yeah. I know it's how you really
Thank you.
because that had it in the call, so you so I know that was good. I wish there was a comparison study
Mm-hmm.
to stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Have you shared this at all with God or
Mm-hmm. In this exact same room, actually.
you did?
Yes. Yep.
And how was it?
I don't know. Am I free to share that? It was good. It was good. Better than I anticipated. Let's put it that way. I think. Am I allowed to share all this? Okay. I think going into that, I was nervous. I wasn't sure how it would be received. But by the end, it was well received. And he was very interested in checking with other departments, doing something similar with other departments just to see what's going on. And there's obviously a lot more areas that could be researched. So I realized this is not the end all. It was just one piece of the puzzle.
So then, trying to be careful too. Have the EDs actually done anything in terms of getting them interested, changing how they emphasize the SCs and the
Nothing has happened since I shared my piece and kind of let it go. So yeah, no, I mean, so nothing has happened since then that I know of. I know that when I did share there, the book has been read by certain recruiters on campus. I don't know, I haven't necessarily seen fruit of that because they were also some of them the same people that I interviewed. So, so to me, there's a difference between reading it and actually like, what are we going to do about this? So. Only recruiters. Yeah.
So, of course, I don't know anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know the work now.
Yeah.
But I know the other so when they were talking, was there any comparison? With people that have been here for a long time, was there any comparison? I used to feel this way, but now I feel, or I used to feel this, and you know, so you can see, right?
So that I know kind of what's going. There were a few things that were mentioned, like, you know, back in the day or whatever, but yeah, I can't necessarily compare. I think the best thing would be to take this piece, this snapshot, because there has been a lot of change even since my interviews. A lot of those people are no longer here. So like if you look even maybe 3 years down the road, doing another sample to say, are things the same? Are they different? Like, I think that would be the next best thing. Which was never me. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, they see it, part of it, they realize that things are changing as far as, like, you know, the market, the industry, but I think all of those, I could be wrong. I'm not sure that they can all be dissected separately. Like, I feel like they're all kind of connected, you know, like there's communication is hard to extract from other things, you know, like communication, it's a team effort, you know what I mean? So you can't say, like, I don't know, in my thought, like it would be hard to say, well, we only have communication issues with these two groups. Well, there seems to be a general communication issue, I guess. So I think it's hard to distract or separate a lot of those. I think that they all might be more entwined than we think about. Like there is an environmental issue, but what are we doing about it? Like, are we being innovative and creative to overcome that and bring some change? Does that make sense? Is that the environment that you're talking about? Like, Mm-hmm. Right, which is part of the. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think based on my like research, I would say that would fall under the innovation and empowerment area, where it's maybe not necessarily leadership, but what is the Christian university or what are the employees doing to overcome that? Because I know from my own experience, I can't just say, well, to me it feels powerless to say, I just have a hard time, students aren't coming to me, or they're not there. What am I going to do? But it's my responsibility to get students into my cohort. So what am I going to do differently to get them there? Or what is the Christian university going to do differently to get them there? Does that make sense? Like, I think it's more of taking on responsibility than it is, okay, well, we just have this is just here. We can't do anything about it. Like, we have to do something. So at what point do we take ownership and start bringing change? Does that answer that a little bit? Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Like a disconnect. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're off again a little bit. All the research about satisfaction at work, that most satisfied people are the ones that can say, I had a best friend at work. And so with all the organizational structure changes that happen, many people lost their best friends. And so I think that really does speak a little bit to the anxiety and stress level that definitely coincide with, family relationships, love languages, sharing, all of those things, definitely
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You understand communicate better with people who have a relationship.
Yeah.
We don't have a relationship with them. We don't know what the love languages are.
Exactly. It's about like the knowing of, yeah. And I think, can I add too, like going off of, it was fascinating to me as well. I loved it. But I found have you read Love and Respect? Are you familiar with that? Okay. I hadn't read it. It's been on my list for years, and it all came up right around the same time. So it was all part of my growing process I had to go through. But and I'm not married, so that's even more fun. But I just realized that in the whole, like the gist of that book is that men have this innate need for respect, and women have this innate need for love. And so when they're not getting their needs met, they start acting out or cutting off what the other person wants. And so it ends up like creating division almost, but if they take time to stop and like start giving the other person what the other person needs, it in turn allows that person to give back. So to me, I feel like what you were commenting on, I think it's really easy, especially in stressful situations or whatever, we start withholding, or start whatever, and it almost creates and so it almost creates the opposite effect. And so I think that concept can still be applied even in the workplace. You can ask me about that. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Right. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. I think it does have to be a balance, because I think this one. So they don't attend. Like if you have trust, you want, if it's cultivated in the right way, you want to perform. You want to bring about the bottom line. But I think it. Yeah. I think it's. I think I understand what you're saying, but I think that like you can't always produce the right results. If you're not producing results, you have to start looking lower. You have to start looking beyond, because you can say, okay, this is what you need to do. Well, how do I get there? You have to lead someone to get results. You have to teach them the way to go. You have to you can't just do it. I think it's easy to be like, okay, go get students. How does that happen? And it might happen differently for different people, but they just don't show up, So how do we do that? And I think but if you only focus on results and you lose sometimes in order to get better results, you might have to deal with some conflict and deal healthily with instead of one person saying, this is how I'm gonna do it, then we can't, if you can't speak and you're like, you know what? We talked about resistance. That was probably the most fascinating thing I learned in all of my MBA. It was my very first class, and we talked about resistance. And I realized I used to always fear resistance because it was scary. And it was conflict, really. And people would shut me down, and so then I would feel shut down, and I would just cut them off and go on. That doesn't work. The point of resistance, I don't know if you guys have seen Saving Mr. Banks. I wrote a big paper on it in my first module. But it's the story of how Walt Disney got the rights to Mary Poppins. which may not sound super exciting to you, but it was fascinating to me to watch at the same time that I was reading about resistance. And because she was super resistant, like she did not want anything to do with him getting these rights. But he was passionate about having those rights, so they worked together. And in the end results, like even though she had some pretty outrageous, like you can't do this, all this stuff, and he worked with her, and it produced a better result that allowed it to become more popular than it would have if he had just focused on his original intent. Does that make sense? But they had to deal with conflict and resistance, and they say that like resistance, it can bring about a better result, but it can also, those people that were resistant, if you work to win them over and if you work with them, they will actually become your better supporters. And so I think if you don't have trust, and you only focus on results, you could miss a better result, if that makes sense. So. Oh, thank you. I got my transcript.
Maybe a week.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming. Yeah.